Hello, and welcome to today's CA Service Operations Insight Global User Community Webcast. My name is Lisa, and I will be your event specialist. At this time, all lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. After the speaker's remarks, there will be a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during this time, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. If you would like to withdraw your question, press the pound key. I would now like to turn today's call over to your host, Mr. Stephen Sheldon, Community President. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to our May webcast. Had a great CA World. It was really nice meeting everybody there that I got to meet from not only SOI, but all the other communities and products. It was a really great CA World this year. And we attended the Leadership Summit as well and got some really neat ideas for the community from other community leaders and hearing what they're doing with their communities. So definitely expect some great changes coming up this year from the community. I'm going to start wanting to do polls more frequently, so definitely check back on the community site for answering different polls about what sort of webcasts you'd like to see, how the community can better serve you, how the product could be better, how you're using the product, variety of topics there. I'm going to try to change those out going forward on a monthly basis. So definitely try to come back there as much as possible for that. And I also just really want to thank all of the CA folks who have been responding to the ideas and answering the community posts as well. I'm getting some really good involvement there and expect more of that coming forward as well. And today we've got a really great session planned. Dave is going to give an overview of what happened at CA World and the product in general going forward. And then followed by that, Jeff Morris is going to be giving us a presentation on how to troubleshoot SOI and various issues you might come across. Following that, I would definitely love as much participation as possible with asking Jeff questions about SOI troubleshooting. Anything at all that you've been curious about from troubleshooting SOI, questions about what he's shown here in general, definitely feel free to ask questions there. It'll be a great time for that. And one of the highlights from CA World, and I think David's going to be going over as well, is that SOI, out of all the CA communities, was the single biggest growing over the last year. So that is really impressive. Thank you all for that. Without any further ado, Dave, go for it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
And I am clicking the slides. All right, here we go. So my piece will be brief, but I do want to talk about CA World, a CA World wrap-up from the SOI perspective briefly, and then a quick touch on our roadmap using a couple of the slides that we showed at CA World, and then a solicitation to participate in our upcoming end-of-sprint reviews. So that's my brief agenda. And as always, anything we say in this kind of thing can't be trusted. So, however, we will be doing our best, but this is our legal disclaimer, just because we're doing some forward-looking stuff. CA World overview. We have different focus areas at CA World. If you were there, you know this, but in addition to the CEO level keynotes, we had various focus areas for breakouts. The service assurance focus area session drew the largest audience among all of those sessions. So service assurance is #1 on our customers' minds. It was very much an overflowing session with Mike Sargent, our general manager, presenting the overall service assurance story. Most CA World presentations, including all of our customer-led presentations, are available in PDF format on that website. So if you have any trouble with that, let us know. From an SOI perspective, we did have an excellent presence at the show and a great level of customer participation. We had multiple sessions. We had overview, roadmap, service modeling, hands-on labs, and implementation guidance or services implementation types of sessions. We also had many customer-presented case studies, 8 formal sessions plus a 9th, which was Stephen presenting at the back end of one of my formal sessions. So all these guys were highlighting their use of SOI in the full service assurance suite, and indeed it may be some of you on this call as well. So thank you for that. We also had lots of one-on-one customer meetings with product management, development management, executive management. So thank you for all your positive interactions that we had and letting us know how well we're doing as well as where we need continual improvement. So keep us honest, keep us in the loop with your considerations of the product as we go. And as Stephen mentioned, we were recognized for being the fastest growing community, and there was an actual iPod received as a result of that, which was awesome. iPad, excuse me. So briefly, the roadmap update is that we have now a current release, which is 3.1, as you may know, and it is a service pack level type release, so you have to install 3.0 first, and then it brings along all the patches that you need to be current within 3.1. The connectors are on their own timelines, their own roadmaps, so those are coming in asynchronous to the core product, but there are additional updates in progress there. Coming up, we have a thing called 3.2, which is planned for release in the second half of this calendar year. It is, for the most part, the feature set that we described to you last year in 3.5. What we did instead, as you know, is delay the roadmap a little bit and sort of those couple of service pack releases. And then the major difference from 3.5 to 3.2 is that we're going to stay on Catalyst 2.5, which is the existing Catalyst integration platform that we're on right now. In calendar year 14, that should say CY 14, we will pick up the next generation of CA platform is our intent at this point. If you were at CA World and heard Mike Gregoire's discussion, his keynote, he talked about how important the platform, the CA platform was going forwards. So we're going to be looking to sync up with the rapid evolution that those guys are involved in and take advantage of those capabilities. From a semi-graphical perspective, we have, this is sort of the layout, the 3.1 and even previous to that, the SB3 patch, the service pack level stuff was involved with these various abilities, so usability, stability, supportability, and so on. So those are fairly well known at this point. 3.2, I got another slide on in a minute, and then I'll pretty much be done. But then going out into the 4.0, next year sort of time frame, various continued enhancements of event alert management and service modeling. Service templates is one thing that was in 3.5 that we are not shipping in 3.2, but we intend to clean that up. Additional ideas like doing change impact analysis, being able to see what impact potential changes might do, sort of a what-if type editor is one concept we have for this time frame. An outage editor, being able to understand which outages were occurring and maybe even go back and edit those in time so you can adjust your SLA impacts of various issues. And then the platform alignment, as I mentioned, is key. There's also a potential SaaS lever here in 2014 where we're going to be exploring the potential SaaS delivery, software as a service delivery of SOI as part of the overall service assurance platform. But that's still relatively high-level thinking in this moment, and we're sorting out where we're going in that direction. From a 3.2 specific perspective, enhanced service discovery and management is the first thing. So there are several new knobs on service discovery and controls, and the ability to start and stop it and get a better handle on what it is doing. Audit trail additions, so we're going to be adding a host of auditing capabilities to the product and various on and off switches for each one of those things on a very granular basis. Introducing a headless API, so we'll be able to drive this thing from a web services API perspective in a relatively complete fashion for integrating with various other systems from a programmatic perspective. Customer-centric management is a big feature where we're, in addition to our current alert queue and service-oriented paradigms, we're adding a customer-oriented management paradigm, which has its own views and its own implications. Rapidly UI-based event translation and normalization is a lot of words, but what that means is we're putting a user interface on our ability to take in raw SNMP traps. If today you want to parse a raw SNMP trap into SOI, you have to use XML. This is adding a user interface onto that. We're working on some enhanced root cause analysis in concert with Spectrum, so the timing on this is in question a little bit right now because we're having to coordinate with our Spectrum colleagues, but that will be worth having when we get it. And then finally, using that new Web Services API to enhance the mobile dashboard and do some testing on support for newer devices. So finally, what I wanted to do was solicit for participation in our end-of-sprint reviews. We are restarting the end-of-sprint review process, which we haven't done for a while as we've been working on these service packs, and would like to have everyone participate. And in order to participate, however, there is a registration process. And it's effectively a beta sign-up. It's relatively lightweight. It is one dense page of legalese, so it might take, somebody glancing, running through the thing and making sure there's nothing to upset you, but it is a very standard CA beta participation set of boilerplate. So I would encourage you to hit this link and sign up so that we can get you in our list for a more detailed view of Sprint output every month. We intend to start these next month and proceed then on a monthly basis. So we'll send this out on the community so you don't have to memorize this link, but I did want to get that out there and start to rebuild that end-of-sprint review process with the group. So that is all I wanted to cover today, and I want to turn it over to Jeff to conduct the majority of the session, and I am making you presenter, Jeff.
Thanks a lot, Dave. And if you guys have any questions about what Dave said about any of that, feel free to ask that at the end as well.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Stephen. So we're going to talk. Can everybody see the slides okay? I want to make sure I did this right on my end.
I can see them.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to talk about troubleshooting today. Troubleshooting is a pretty big topic in general. With SOI, it's certainly something we can't really cover in complete depth in 30 minutes, but what I'm going to try to do is give you an overview and some background on it and talk to you as much about details as about a methodology for doing so. So essentially, let's see if I can page this thing down here. What I want to go through is a little bit about what the challenges are with troubleshooting in general, talk about some basics of troubleshooting that you can apply to SOI as well as really any application. Talk a little bit about the SOI architecture and connector flow, which I think is one of the key topics. It's a key part of our architecture is the data flowing in from your connectors. Introduce you to a couple of debugging pages that are available through the UI that you may not be aware of. Talk a little bit more about the connector pieces, some of the logging configuration files and how that can work and how you can change the logging to help in your troubleshooting efforts, and then hopefully get through a quick scenario on troubleshooting missing CIs or alerts. So why is troubleshooting hard? And why is it hard in the context of SOI especially? So asynchronous architectures, which SOI is, if you're not already aware, you may already be aware of this, but it's an asynchronous architecture with a lot of message queuing, passing information around between different components. Those are inherently, applications designed that way are inherently hard to troubleshoot because they're different silos, and you've got to track the flow of data through all the silos to understand what's going on. So that adds some complexity, but it's necessary. This type of an application is necessary to be built that way. So it's not that it's the wrong architecture, it's just troubleshooting, it adds a layer of complexity. And in data-driven applications in general, going into the application space in general, are also harder to troubleshoot because often use cases are different depending on the inputs and outputs. So you can't test everything, and if some weird set of data comes in that hasn't been anticipated, it can cause an application to behave differently than QA might have seen and that you might have known about. So how do we troubleshoot these? How do we approach this? And it often comes down to, is troubleshooting an art or science? I've had this discussion with a few people, and it's really should be, it's kind of a combination of both, I guess. A lot of it is based on instinct, but there is truly a methodology behind it, and most of the failures that we see with people having a hard time troubleshooting are a result of the lack of applying the science to it, in my opinion. Troubleshooting, I guess, to a certain extent, it's a skill that you acquire. It's funny, I've worked in engineering for 25 years, and I've worked with a multitude of very, very, very smart people. But I will tell you that even with all those smart people I've worked with and I continue to work with today, 90 to 95% of people that I encounter really don't have a good troubleshooting approach. And so I want to talk to you about how to improve that to make your lives easier. And the key principles that I think go behind effective troubleshooting is isolation, really isolating the problem down to a smaller space, using a divide and conquer method to handle that, and that's especially important with an asynchronous architecture like SOI. And in understanding the architecture, you can't troubleshoot something that you don't understand how it works. There needs to be a basic understanding of the overall flow to be able to do effective troubleshooting. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit more about Occam's razor. I think that approach, if you're familiar with that, is extremely important in troubleshooting applications. So what's the basic methodology? I think it's relatively straightforward. It's a matter of following it. First, you formulate one or more theories based upon the initial symptoms. There's always a symptom of what's wrong or what do we see. So we have to start there, no different than if you were a doctor assessing a patient. And we often use the hospital and triage analogies when we talk about this kind of thing. So then you need to conclusively validate your theory by looking at data. You can't just say because you have a theory that doesn't make it right. There has to be something to back it up. And if there's multiple theories, which there often are, especially in things like this, you need to eliminate theories by finding conflicting data until one is only remaining. If you can't, unless you can conclusively get your first theory out, you're great. If you can prove it, you're done. And this is where Occam's razor comes in. If you're not familiar with it, it goes back to, I think, the 14th century. But it's really that the simplest thing is generally likely to be the thing. So use that as your driving principle, right? So I've put together some rules that I think kind of go along that methodology, that if you follow these rules, I think you'll have a much better job troubleshooting symptoms. The first thing, and you're going to see this word 100 times in this presentation, it's all about data. You can't troubleshoot out of a vacuum. So you have to use data. And if the data doesn't match your theory, no matter how much you're emotionally attached to it and how much you might have seen something super similar in the past, your theory is wrong. So you need to adhere to that principle, and this is especially true with SOI, because you can, in anything of an asynchronous nature, there are often multiple things that you can consider, but we have to use the data to drive us towards the conclusion. And this is where the Occam's razor comes in. You just prioritize your theories. If you've got 3 or 4 of one, start with the one that's most likely. I mean, you can I often get in arguments with people that say, well, it could be this. Well, yeah, but it could be, and the 1% of the time it might be. But I'd rather start with the thing that's more likely to be the case. That's why I say initial time. Eventually, if you start exhausting all the other ones, you can come back to that. But let's start down the path of the one that makes the most sense and is most likely to be the case. And this third one is just instinct and experience only go so far. And this gets back to the thing I said before. Most people try to troubleshoot completely by instinct and just try to guess. And it really ends up with the throwing darts against the wall syndrome. And if you're not using any data to back up anything, you waste a lot of time going down dead ends, and that's what you don't have. Troubleshooting relies upon doing things quickly. You can't explore every theory, so you have to put yourself in a position to explore the most likely ones, and if you follow this methodology, you'll get there, usually within the first couple. The divide and conquer I mentioned before. It's all about isolation. And it's especially important with SOI and other asynchronous pieces. Try to work from the middle out. If you can understand if there's a whole flow, you can start in the middle. It's very much along the same lines as a binary search technique as opposed to sequential search. If I start in the middle, I can eliminate half of the other theories by saying that the problem exists, in the first half or the second half, or one component or another component. So use the isolation and use techniques that get you to isolate. And once you've eliminated something, it's eliminated, right? If you've got data that eliminates it, don't keep coming back to it. And then trial and error, again, is the last resort. There's nothing that drives me more crazy than try this, no, try that, no, try this, when there's nothing really behind any of the things to try. I'll often get to the point where I say, let's try this, but it's based upon rules 1 through 4, saying I've looked at data, I've eliminated problems, and I've got some data that confirms I'm going in the right direction. I may not be 100% sure, but I've done some educated guessing as opposed to random guessing. So I really, these are, when I do troubleshooting, and I do this quite a bit, and I've done quite a bit with SOI, and been pretty successful at it, these are the basic rules I adhere to. And I think if you apply this to SOI and really, frankly, any other applications you have to deal with on a daily basis, you should be more successful. So enough about that. Getting on to SOI. So I mentioned before that it's important to understand the architecture of the product. So I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to things you may not know about how SOI works. You may know, you may not, but this is just a little refresher or primer, if you will. SOI has a variety of components, and most of the communication in SOI takes place between either JMS, putting things on message buses with ActiveMQ, and or HTTP, making web calls, web service or just direct HTTP calls into other components. So we have our core component, which is the manager, and then the UI server talks to the manager. The manager mostly talks to the database. There's some interaction with the UI in the database, but it's primarily UI to manager to database. And behind all of that, you've got all your connectors that are sending data. So the connectors are out there connected to all your domain managers, Spectrum, APM, eHealth, third-party products, SCOM, whatever you have in your environment. They're collecting the data, doing the transformation. This is where our Catalyst piece comes into play, and then sending that up along the way to the manager who's listening on this JMS bus that you see here and processing the data into the database. So that's the basic architecture, and you can see, it's the message queuing that makes it asynchronous. These things happen independent of one another, and they're just processes that wait. Much of it is asynchronous. Of course, a lot of your UI calls will be synchronous, but that's the nature of isolation. So understanding, and when you have a problem, starting with the symptom and isolating which of the components is the problematic one is a very important piece of getting that. Any questions about the architecture before I move off of this? This may be new. The other stuff, or frankly anything at the beginning, although that was mostly just methodology type stuff.
If you'd like to ask a question at this time, simply press star and the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for a moment to compile the Q&A roster.
Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead, just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on, but then if a question comes in, we'll back up. So going off of the architecture diagram, just a quick list of the key services that comprise SOI. So SOI is deployed on Windows, as you know, and it's manufacturer of Windows services that represent the components in the previous diagram. So the manager is a Tomcat application, so this is all Java-based web application, and it listens on this port for some of the debug and admin pages, but it's primarily headless, the UI, the manager itself. The UI HTTP is there for some of the communication with the UI server, but you're not generally going to connect to the SOI directly unless you're looking at one of the debug pages. The UI server is the primary presentation layer, and it can be distributed. As you know, you can have more than one UI server. And it will host the GUI, and you connect to that on port 7070, as you've seen. And there's a Java client that launches from there, and it also connects back to the UI server in the same mechanism, just using Java. So then we get, that's the core components that you'd interact with. Then we move on to what we call integration services, which is the connector host. It's a container, and the different connectors run within one or more of these containers. And this is the most distributed part of the architecture. You can have one or more of these running on different machines. The architecture really only supports one container per machine, but within one container you can have multiple connectors up to the limit of memory that you have in the machine. That's generally the limiting factor on the integration services component. And it then communicates, as you saw before, on that active messaging bus. It collects data and passes it on there. The event management is a component that works side by side with the integration framework. It's mostly there. It was added in SOI 3.0, and it was primarily there to deal with the local event store and doing some of the event queries that were added and some of the event filtering that was added as far as the event management component. The other pieces then, the UCF broker really works with the manager. I probably should have left it up in that because it kind of goes together with the manager, but it's just a smaller component. It's there primarily to support what we call southbound integration, which is a mechanism by which SOI can then send data out to the connector, the domain manager, some specific ones like Spectrum and SCOM that support this interface to retrieve data in the opposite direction than it normally flows through the Catalyst mechanism. And then the store indexer is just something that supports a query, a web query tool we have into the database of Catalyst, and it just keeps some stuff indexed on the file system so that it can allow faster access to that web component. So it runs kind of there, it just keeps track of the database and keeps its own non-database index so that the web server doesn't have to hit the database server every time. So those are the key components, but the ones you'll interact with the most that take the most load would be the manager, the integration services, and the UI server, the top three on this list. I almost never even look at the other three for troubleshooting for the most part, because they're not doing nearly as much as the rest in terms of workload. Okay, so moving on. So some of the things you can use on a troubleshoot based upon that. Knowing the architecture, as I say, is key. When you're thinking of isolation, you want to know understand which of those components a problem might be coming from before moving on. Things you can look at, though, and there's a couple new things here. So first of all, if you're not familiar with these pages, on the manager and the UI server both have this, and it's very similar structure because, as I said, they're both based off a similar Tomcat architecture. But there's this SAM debug page, which is primarily back-end things that you use that engineering might have you go through or support. But for you yourselves, you could certainly use this. There's a new page that was added in 3.1, maybe SP3, I can't remember off the top of my head now, called triage tests, which will tell you that that process is completely up and running. So if you hit that, go to this link and hit the triage test link on the left-hand side and make sure it's completed. I generally do that before moving on, right? If the manager hasn't gone to a completed status, if I'm starting up from scratch, I generally don't start anything else because anything else is simply going to add more load to that and slow it down. So I generally bring my environment up in a stair-step fashion, and I use this to help me know when it's ready for the next stage. One other thing that can happen sometimes for a variety of reasons is if the manager gets really busy for some reason, too many messages are coming in, you can use this thread pools to look for backed up messages. So it's a troubleshooting technique just to know if that's happening or not. And if you get a bunch of messages showing up in this and it keeps growing, then that's an indicator. And this is the type of information you'd want to have for yourself, and also if you get on the phone with support, let them know. It will help short-circuit the process of finding the issue. There's a thread info piece there as well. I'm sorry, was there a question?
Jeff, I just wanted to make sure people noticed that for the manager, it's port 7090, and the UI server, it's 7070, in case anyone's pulling up these pages on their own system as you're going through it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. They listen on different ports so that they can theoretically be run on the same server. In some environments we do, and generally in our testing environments we'll do that. In a production environment, they're usually on separate servers, but so they can run on the same server, they listen on different ports. And the manager listens differently. You're probably used to logging to the UI server on 7070, but if you need to hit these manager pages, you'll go on the 7090 port. So thanks for that, Stephen. Then this thread info is something that may not mean a lot to you, but engineering could use it if you're trying to figure out if the manager's busy doing something. That's one of the things about asynchronous applications is there can be things going on that are not part of one specific transaction, but they're doing work on behalf of others through the asynchronous architecture. So the same thing on the UI server. The UI server now has these triage tests as well, so you can validate when it's up and running as well and ready to be receiving requests. So I want to talk about the connector data flow because this is this is probably the most complicated asynchronous part of the solution, and most of what you care about when you're looking at SOI is the data that's coming from these different connectors. So when I talk about isolation, it's important to isolate messages along this flow, and this plays into what we're going to talk about in terms of our use case. So the way it works, and I don't really have it's in the context of that diagram. I didn't really have a good slide that puts the two together, so you can go back and review this with the slide deck later, which I'm sure will be made available. So there's the framework, the ISW, Integration Services piece we talked about before, which is it's going to be set up, each connector is going to connect to the domain manager, whatever it is, Spectrum, APM, et cetera. And through that connection, there's an API that it implements, and it's going to go out and basically ask the domain manager for all the CIs and alerts that it has. And so it's going to collect that data back into the connector application, the integration framework. Then this is where the data transformation occurs, and we talk about USM as our unified service model, and we're basically translating from whatever the language is of the domain, Spectrum, APM, into USM. Right, which is basically what I call English in the context of what we're trying to accomplish. So that happens within that framework, and then the transformed CI or alert is then put on a message bus. This is where the message bus part starts. It's put on this message queue and sent off to be processed. Now the first stop along the way to the manager is this thing we call the mid-tier connector, which generally runs on the manager server in a separate ISW instance. And so that thing is sitting there listening on the queue for all the messages coming from different domain managers, and it will look at these messages, and it can perform additional filtering. If you deploy filtering policies, it can be done there. Things that are based upon any kind of cross-domain rules will have to occur in MTC. Enrichment will also take place there if you put some enrichment rules where you want to change the event. That all happens with this mid-tier connector. And then, so if for some reason that's not running, that's one place things get stuck. Now, I don't see that happen very often, but it can happen, and it's important to know that it's there. Then when it's done doing whatever processing it needs to do, it puts the result message back on another queue that another part of the manager will retrieve. And at that point, when the manager gets a hold of it, it's going to then process this thing and persist it into the database. So part of it's saving it to the database, and then it also is sending it off to Catalyst to do the processing that's specific to what we call the notebooks and correlation, which, as you know, if you've worked with SOI very much, correlation is critical to the architecture. It's one of the key important features of the product that can tell you that a CI coming from Spectrum and one coming from eHealth are truly the same CI, and so that any alerts coming from either place should show up in the same place in the UI, and it should really be considered the same entity. So that's all done through our Catalyst framework, and we use these concepts called USM notebooks, which you will have noticed if you've looked at the UI, to understand how the data is coming in and being correlated from the different domain managers. So that happens, and there's some additional database persistence that happens there. And then ultimately, in the example of an alert, then the UI server is going to get notified that this new alert's arrived, and it's going to then have to map it to the appropriate place in the GUI, which would be either an alert queue, any of the alert queues that match the criteria for that alert, and or any service models that contain the CI that the alert is attached to. So part of this manager process is to take an alert and bind it to its appropriate CI. One of the things we saw on older versions of SOI was that we would get alerts that would kind of get lost, but some of that's been dealt with in 3.1 with this concept of the unknown CI. If the alert can't find the associated CI, rather than throwing it off into the earth, we now attach it to the unknown CI. But there's still a process to understand that. So this is the flow of data that goes through the whole system that has to happen. So all this has to be working, all this plumbing has to be working for everything to get so that you can finally see this data on the screen. So if something's not working, and that's what the troubleshooting is all about, where do we look? So on the manager, and again, asynchronous architecture, one of the byproducts of that is that each component is going to have its own logs. And there's not really much you can do about that. That's just the nature of an asynchronous application. And so we've got the Tomcat logs under SOI directory in the manager. And really, we've changed some of the names with 3.1, so you'll see I've got both names listed here. There's SAM log, SAM error log, and SAM debug log, which generally offer logging against the manager with different levels of verbosity. So these are now renamed as SOI Manager Log, SOI Manager Error, and SOI Manager Debug. So you can see quite a bit of data on here. If anything's going wrong, you certainly want to look for error messages that might point to what's happening. This conmanager.log is there to support a lot of the connector flow. You can turn on connector manager debugging in the GUI, and I didn't put a slide in for this. I probably should have. But there's on the debug pages, there's a place where you can set up the connector manager debugging, and that will dump out some very verbose information about every CI coming in to this log file, which really is the last step in the chain. When the manager receives the CI from the queue and then does something with it, anything that happened will show up in here. So this is important for if you're getting to the point where you're trying to track down a piece of data. The Catalyst log and trace.log are mostly focused on what Catalyst is doing, and primarily on the southbound synchronization use case. Not every customer uses that, but if you're using that and you're trying to troubleshoot it, that's where you're going to look for those pieces. And then there's also what we call the wrapper logs. So every service, every one of those 6 services I showed you, has its own service log, which will maybe have other information that's useful. And in the case of the manager, it's the SAM Tomcat wrapper log, which is under a different directory. It shows up under these JSW logs from the path perspective. Now, a similar format on the connector, just a little bit different architecture of the directory. So there's a log, and in fact, this is a typo. I just noticed on my PowerPoint. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm right. It's correct. So the first one is the JSW logs. Now, I've put these in the order that I normally look at them at. And the way the connectors work, the integration services wrapper log is often very important because it logs when things are being published to the queues. So I often will be looking in there to make sure that's occurring. And it also keeps track of all of the life cycle events that occur with different connectors starting up or stopping, so we can really get a good idea of whether the connector is successful in starting. So I generally look there first for any issues with connectors themselves, just with the overall workings of the connector and publishing of data. There's also this concept of debug data, which is something that's not on by default, but you can configure it, where every CI and alert that's coming in from a domain will be logged to to some files in this directory. This is really if you're having data or flow issues, and again, this gets back to the first thing one of the first things I was telling you is the data-driven applications. Oftentimes, it's not really the application itself that's having an issue, it's the data is not what you expected it to be. Not what the application expected it to be, not what you expected it to be, and it's causing behavior that's not what you deem to be correct. So looking at the data is sometimes important. And so if you have a scenario like that where you don't think the CIs are going where they're supposed to be or they're not matching up together from the different domains, this is where you'll look at where you can see what was actually being sent by the connector and how it was being translated into SOI. So if there's any issues there that you maybe need to change a connector policy file. I mean, SOI was built with this architecture that to be able to make it work in multiple, we're trying to basically build a product that can handle all the integration needs from all these different domain repositories for all of the Fortune 1000 companies in the world that are doing this. So that's a pretty tall order, and the architecture is really built upon configuration. It's common that you'll have to make a configuration change here or there, and this may be part of it. So this is where you would be debugging that. So that would be the debug data where you find all that data. And then there's another log file called IFW log, which has some additional connector stuff logging. I generally don't find myself having to go there that often, but occasionally it comes in handy if I can't find what I'm looking for in the other two places. Okay, so there was a question that seems like it's come in about the unknown CI. So I'm going to leave it for the end, but if I have time, I'll come back to it. If not, I'll answer privately, or I'll blast something out to Stephen or Dave who can get it out to the community, the answer to this question. So I'll just for the person who asked that, I'll just hang on and I'll come back to it in a bit. So how do we turn on this debug data if you need to do it? So there's a key these are on the connector machines. There's this log for JXML under the resources directory. And there's two places that are, the nice thing about this config file is it's got all the things you'd ever need, but it's all commented out. So you've just got to find these two sections for raw entity and pub entity. There's a lot of other stuff in there. I've never really found the need to use any of it other than these two things. One thing I have seen that I'm going to work on is there's a way to turn on like full debugging of the whole IFW, which I've used that a couple times, and generally it's not needed. Mostly you can get it from just these two. So I would do this first and then come to that as the last step. But this is the thing, if you want to get those debug data files, this is how you get them to start showing up in that debug data directory, and that's the verbose entries of all the CI data. Again, primarily for troubleshooting just data, knowing what's actually coming in from connectors and how it's being translated. So how do we troubleshoot a missing alert or a CI? Like, I think I'm expecting this data and it's not showing up, or I'm seeing this in Spectrum and I'm not seeing it in SOI. Now, as I said before, this used to be a bigger problem than a lot of, as Dave mentioned at the beginning of the call, there's been a lot of, stability things that have been added to the product to clean this up. So I don't see this scenario nearly as much as I used to see it a year ago, but it's still a valid thing. There's a lot of different ways that something could happen. When you're integrating this many components together, things can go wrong in different places. I mean, we're bringing all the domain managers too. Now we're responsible for making sure they're doing their job. So a lot of things are involved here. But how do we use? This is where I want to use this as an example of how to use isolation to break down what could be a big and complex problem into smaller sets of problems and be very concrete about what's happening. Because if I look at that flow, I showed you a workflow earlier that was 9 steps, right? I could start picking off, I could name 15 different things that could be wrong as to why I'm not getting something at the end step. But without taking a methodical approach, I could spend a lot of time, hours, looking in the wrong place. So really employing these techniques that I mentioned before about isolation will be very helpful. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure the connector sent the CI. Now you can take this, I'm putting this more in an organized fashion, but what I might do is start more in the middle and work my way out. But I'm putting it in order just so you get an idea of the workflow. But I'd probably start in the middle, and see, did it get to the MPC or something? Because if it got there, I don't need to look on the other half. I don't need to look at 3 or 4 steps. So I really would take a binary search approach to this. But here are the cases. So I want to look at the item raw files or the alert raw in that debug data. That basically proves to me that the CI I'm looking for or the alert actually got sent. Right? The connector actually sent it. If it did, then I need to move farther down. If it didn't, then I already have eliminated SOI completely from the problem. It's now simply with the connector maybe, or maybe the domain manager. So we've already, that's the key thing, is eliminating things that can't be. But then we move on to the next step, we can make sure the data is actually transformed. I can look for the corresponding published information to make sure that it was published. I generally skip this step unless I want to go back and look at the data, and I'll go to the next bullet here where you see look in the SAM integration services log. You'll see like publishing alert. That says that this alert was published, and the XXX refers to an MDR element ID of that alert, the name of the alert that it came from the connector. So you can then match that up downstream to that alert when it gets to the manager if you're trying to look for it. So that's an important piece of information to have. But seeing that that thing was published, we know it was put on the message queue bus, right? So then we want to see if it travels along the way. Great, just the fact that it was put on the bus doesn't mean anybody ever listened to it or picked it off. And the first guy that's going to pick it off is this MPC. So you can also look for the SAM integration services log on the manager server, because that's going to be where the MPC logs to, and you should see a corresponding publishing message there for the same thing, meaning that it took it and published it. And then ultimately, you can look on the manager to make sure it processed it, and that's where this con manager log comes in, because that'll have an entry. And you'll search for that unique ID that you found when you looked at the other log file, right? So that's how you can track it end to end. Like I said, I would generally start in the middle and work my way and skip some of the steps and narrow it down. So I might look on the, I would probably look in the integration services log first of the connector, because that kind of divides it between the connector and then farther downstream towards the manager. Then second, I'd probably look at the con manager log to make sure it got to the manager or not, and then work my way in between for the other places. But you can use these log files to figure out what happened with a particular piece of data that you weren't getting. Now, if you're not getting any data at all, that's a different scenario too, and you want to understand what's going on there. You can also look at those thread pools that I showed you on the debug pages. If you see a bunch of stuff stuck in there, that's basically the manager's waiting to process a bunch of things that are in the queue. So I'm going to come back to one other thing that I mentioned with this question before about the unknown CI. So actually, before I go to that question, I think this is a good time to ask for any questions about this workflow. I've just gone through quite a bit of data, and I would imagine there might be some questions. So we've got some time left. Let's talk about that a little bit and see if there's any questions I can answer.
At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad.
And while I'm waiting for those questions to come in, I'm going to answer the question that came from one of you out there that says, how do we recommend that we perform enrichments on these unknown CI since we don't know what it is? Well, so the unknown CI is not a place you'd be performing enrichment on. The unknown CI basically is an alert that couldn't find a matching CI. So what you have to do there, so to understand, is that you have to look at the alert to see what it's trying to assert itself against. And again, a lot of it comes from the data. So in the data, there'll be a thing on an alert called an alerted MDR element ID. That's basically saying this is a CI that I'm trying to match myself up to, the CI that I go against. So if I was going to put an alert on the computer system, the alert would have an alerted MDR element ID. And again, this is coming from the domain manager like Spectrum. I'll use Spectrum as an example. The alerted MDR element ID would be the model handle in Spectrum of that device that I want to assert myself against. So if it ends up landing on the unknown CI, it's because whatever that alerted MDR element ID was not known, that CI wasn't there. So I would want to go troubleshoot, should I have this CI? Why is it not already an SOI? And work my way through the data that way. You wouldn't generally perform enrichment there. Now, you could perform an enrichment once you do that diagnosis, say, oh, these alerts aren't mapping correctly. In fact, I just worked with a customer this week to say, I want to come up with an enrichment to basically change the alerted MDR element ID and run some queries, and you can do some complicated things there. But that was a unique case. It should not be necessary in most cases. Generally, something else is wrong when this is happening, right? There's something in it. You just got to go diagnose the data perspective. You have to just look through it at that point. If you can isolate that to being the problem and you're not really sure where to turn next, that's where you can get support involved. But at that point, you can give them this information. You've already narrowed down the problem when it comes to them. I'm looking for this specific thing, what's going on here, and we can at least get some help around that because you've already done some of the initial diagnosis on your own because there's nobody that knows your data better than you as customers. So the more you can do of this on your own, it's going to make your support process go faster. So I don't know if that answered the question or not, but certainly follow back up with me if we want to have, I'm more than willing to set up follow-up sessions with groups of people to talk about certain topics, and Stephen and I can work on maybe setting those up or maybe just having, if there's some specific topic, we can do it for an upcoming meeting or something like that. There is a lot to this and some specifics once you get past the breadth here. So did we get any other questions? I'm not sure. I don't see anything on my screen, but I don't know if I'm looking in the right place.
There are no phone questions at this time.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'll move on. I don't have much else. That was pretty much what I wanted to cover. Just one more thing I'll say, which is a little bit of a plug for something that I found very useful. Part of it's because I have a background in our APM solution. But as I've been working through with several customers over the past year or so, I've found we've put together internally, myself with some other folks, put together a solution to monitor APM with monitor SOI, with our APM solution. APM lends itself very well to this type of thing, and the key benefit is that you get visibility into a lot of metrics without having to dive through a lot of log files. So it really shortens the time with which you can get to some understanding. If we talk about how it maps to the methodology, the key thing about isolation is being able to figure out kind of where to look. So it at least will point you in the right direction, eliminate a bunch of bad theories right off the bat by looking at data. It provides data, right? And everything I said at the beginning of this is I've got to be able to make decisions based upon data, not based upon guesses. This provides a lot more data to eliminate a lot of bad theories and a lot of dead ends. So that's really where we found it beneficial to really narrow down the scope of problems and get a better understanding into what might be happening. So if this is something that's be interesting to you, we work with product management. This sort of solution is something we're basically willing to give out to folks free of charge, and we're going to be working on a process where our support teams get more and more knowledge about how to use this. Very much the way that we do with the SAP, if you're aware, embeds our APM solution to monitor and support SAP. We're going to be following a similar approach with SOI. It's not fully baked into the product yet where it comes delivered, but I anticipate that happening sometime in the next 6 months to a year. But in the meantime, it's available through support, so you can let them know, or reach out to me. Anybody can reach out to me, and I can get you to the right person to help you with things. I'm here to help make our customers successful with this product. It's a key part of my initiative. So, and other than that, just wanted to say a little bit of a summary on the methodology. Find the data, follow the data. The data doesn't lie. If the data doesn't match your theory is wrong. If you adhere to those principles, I think you'll be successful with troubleshooting SOI or anything else.
Jeff, I got a quick question for you. How would someone know whether they wanted that APM solution or not? What would be the cues to maybe pursue that direction?
Well, it's really I would think it's more if they're interested in having something like that for monitoring, troubleshooting, and helping them out with that. If that's something that they're interested in spending some time, getting. You have to get used to how it works and go through some understanding of it. But once you get past, it depends. We have two groups of customers. We have customers that already have APM in their environments and ones that don't. So the ones that already do, there's probably some already skill sets there, and it would bake right in and plug right in. If you don't, we have to stand up a small enterprise manager instance that would be generally right within your SOI environment, and then there's a few agents that connect to it from SOI, and then a view layer. But there would be a little bit of a learning curve in that aspect, but that's something we can work with you on. And if nothing else, though, we can still put it in, and at least it's a tool that if you do have to call support and your problem gets escalated, then it's a tool that we have. If it's collecting that data, we can use it to help you.
So it's generally, if I think my SOI system is running slow, I should start to think about that kind of performance profiling. Performance is the key. Performance is the number one thing that APM does in general, so it will certainly help with that. What I've found with SOI and some of the things we've been able to do because of some of the data is it actually helps us know about connectors being online or not online, so it can alert each of those situations. You can get us some other data that's not truly performance. It actually helps track whether the messages are getting backed up in the queue, those kind of things that you can get that in a much more proactive fashion, and then they can alert you. In fact, you can even set up a service model in SOI to represent SOI, which may sound crazy, but I've done it, and it actually works for the most part. I think Steven's got that in his environment too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, exactly. It's been very, very helpful for us.
No, in fact, it doesn't sound crazy. In fact, it seems like something we should definitely bake in as we go down the line.
No, we are. And Kathy and I have been working on that. We just, a lot of priorities. It's just about when does the baking occur? So we've put together, is at a point now where we can get it. It's in a distributable fashion. It's now a matter of just baking it in, to the actual thing. I know it's on her list of priorities. I just don't know where it fits into everything else that we're doing. So it may or may not be something that gets delivered in with the 3.2 release. I'm not sure yet. But in the meantime, it's still available as a separate component. It doesn't need to be baked in. That's just more from a packaging perspective.
All right, so does anybody have any questions for Jeff that they'd like to ask now?
There's a question that says from Vitor Silva, is there already a plugin available for SOI? A plugin for what? I wasn't sure if that's related to the APM question or not. So there are, it says it is on APM. It's what it comes with, the deployment is, it's basically you would put the Wiley agent, as I mentioned before, APM is a Java-based application. And so we use a Java agent that would run on the SOI servers as it would install in any other Java application. There's essentially an extra jar file that gets loaded with the other myriad of jar files to do the monitoring component, and then it sends data to the APM server, which we call an enterprise manager, and that's how you would view it. And there's also a component within APM, if you're familiar with the APM technology, called an EP agent, which runs externally and it gathers other metrics. In the case of SOI, we do some both log scraping and HTTP scraping to gather some other key metrics around connectors, numbers, quantities of things. A lot of this is focused around quantities of alerts being published, what the queues, depths, and things are, things that don't come traditionally from your APM performance monitoring, but they're more. But this is a use case that applies well to an asynchronous architecture. So when you put those two things together, basically you get a bunch of metrics in APM that you can use. You can use two pieces. One is for proactive notification if something's not working, as well as diagnostics if something goes wrong. Looking at the historical data is extremely beneficial. I mean, I've solved problems in the last 9 months with SOI that customers have had that would have been nearly unsolvable without APM, or not in any short amount of time, not without throwing major darts at the wall. Remember I said that you use that technique as a source of last resort. When you have no data, that's your last resort. You got to just start trying stuff. With APM, it eliminates the need to throw darts at the wall. Or not eliminates, it reduces it. Reduces when you have to do it. Yeah.
And it's worth noting, too, I mean, APM is incredibly helpful for this, too, but if you guys have any other of the tools in the service assurance suite from CA, build out a global collection and spectrum for all the different SOI components, monitor their response times with ADA, see what data is going to them and how much with NFA. There's lots of options out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I got another question from Vitor, and the answer is yes. So if you're very interested in that, Vitor, go ahead and you see my emails on the screen. Send me an email and we'll sync up, and I'll make sure we get you hooked up.
All right, I just had a little poll I wanted to put up here at the end then. Otherwise, thank you everybody for attending. If you can see the poll, it should be on the bottom right of your screens, I believe, just to try to get an idea of what people want to see for future webcasts here. But thank you everybody for attending. This will be posted on the community site as well, on the message boards there. So if you want to see a replay of it at any point, I know it's a lot of data, so I'm sure I'm going to be rewatching it again. But thanks everyone for attending. We'll talk to you again in a few months.
This concludes today's conference. You may now disconnect.